Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. The topic today, the second half of our lecture on the 1960s and the fracturing of America. As always, take a quick moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down our outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect the ideas together. Now, also, quick note, we are starting today with point 4 on the lecture outline, i.e. 1968, the turning point. And so with that, let's get started. Historians are fascinated by the year 1968. Remember, up to this point in the 1960s, we've had a lot of racial violence, we've had riots break out, and of course, we've had building up in Vietnam. But the boiling point of all these things comes in 1968. And in fact, 1968 can be seen as a turning point for so many things in American history. For example, liberalism. In 1964, liberalism was at an all-time high. 1968 is the turning point for its decline. Vietnam. It had been ramping up for the past 4 years, and really for the past 8 years. But 1968 is the turning point in Vietnam. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. Civil rights. Civil rights takes a brand new turn in 1968. So all these things, and again, this is a big year. Now, we can't cover them all, but I want to offer you just a couple snippet highlights, and then we'll get to the meat of our discussion. So first and foremost, one of the big things that happened in 1968, more of non-major thing is, well, as you see the title, it's the year that shaped a generation. One big event, the first interracial kiss on live television. And of course, it comes from Star Trek. And I love the quote below that. Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, says, "Where I come from, size, shape, or color makes no difference." Now think about this for a moment. This is the 1960s. Interracial marriage was looked down upon. Interracial relationships were strained, if never accepted. Some states still ban them. This is a time we have racial violence all across our country. Jim Crow has just been broken. Just a couple years prior, we signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And now on national television, we're having an interracial kiss. This was a big deal. It was such a big deal on Star Trek that William Shatner, I'm forgetting the woman's name who played Lieutenant Uhura here, they were so scared that CBS would not have the guts to actually air the kiss, that they made sure that they messed up something in every take. You know, when you're making a show or a movie, the director does multiple takes of every scene and chooses the best one to fit, well, the final product in the editing room. And they were so scared that basically CBS would chicken out, that they made sure that every other take, other than the one where they actually do kiss, that there was some mistake. So that way they were sure the director would not pick those scenes. And so, yes, the first interracial kiss came in Star Trek. Again, this is a monumental deal. Second big event, the Olympics that year in Mexico City. African Americans did their country proud. They won numerous gold medals and medals overall in the Summer Olympics held in Mexico City. But there was controversy. In track and field, you see the picture here. Very famously, 2 track stars, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, when they got to the medal stand, they very famously put up the fist in the air during the national anthem. They were protesting the racial inequality in America. They were signifying Black power. If you look at the text below it, you see that he also wore a black scarf to represent Black pride. Remember, they're proud of being Black, the idea of Blackness. He wore black socks with no shoes to symbolize the poverty in America, especially in those urban centers that had largely felt they'd been left out of the modern civil rights movement led by Dr. King. He wore beads, which he explained were, quote, for those individuals lynched or killed and no one ever said a prayer for, that were hung and tarred, unquote. Again, this is the idea of like Catholic prayer beads. You know, the idea you pray for those, pray for the souls. Now, maybe unsurprisingly, 2 days after this silent protest, they were expelled from Team USA. However, when they returned home to their communities, they were hailed as heroes to the African American community because they were bringing the attention to a national stage, at the world stage. If you want to compare modernly, think of the kneeling to the national anthem that Colin Kaepernick began, and others have followed. Again, it's a national stage in which to protest this incredible racial violence in America. So we see this racial tension, but it all kind of culminates in March of 1968. In March of 1968, public sanitation workers were on strike in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, they were arguing for the usual things: higher wages, better treatment. What's interesting here is late 1967, early 1968 was really the first time that Dr. Martin Luther King ever left the South. I don't mean that he never traveled north, but it was after the passage of the 1965 Voting Act. And there's also a Housing Act 1966. It was after this that he finally began to say, oh, well, where do we go next in the civil rights movement? And the answer, of course, was to the west, to the north, to those big urban centers like Chicago, where that housed thousands of African Americans who were living in poverty and were not really impacted by these, civil rights acts because, well, they were living in de facto segregation, not Jim Crow. But they were concerned about economic issues. And so it was not until 1967, early 1968, that Dr. King really began to go into the North and tour these cities. And so sure enough, in Memphis, Tennessee, in March of 1968, there was a sanitation strike. Most of the sanitation workers were African American. And Dr. King went to provide support. And April 3rd, he will give a very famous one of his speeches called, "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And again, he's showing solidarity and support, but this time it's not for integration. This time it's about economic equality. This is a very big turn for Dr. King. This is a very big turn for the modern civil rights movement because the focus is no longer integration, but economic equality, equal pay for equal work, and or higher pay for these traditionally lower paying jobs. And sure enough, on April 3rd, 1968, he gives a speech they go back to their hotel in Memphis, and they stay at a local Memphis hotel you see pictured here. And sure enough, on the evening of April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is shot by James Earl Ray. You see him on the ground there, his friends pointing to the shooter. And on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated at age 39, which parallels Malcolm X. Both coincidentally died at age 39. And again, I want to make a reference here, and that is he's been at it for a decade now, since the Montgomery bus boycott. And yes, there were bombs going off at churches he would visit. There was crosses burned in his yard, and there was general violence against him. But no one tried to assassinate him until he began talking about economic equality, until he began pushing the issue outside the South. This is when someone finally tried and did actually assassinate him. Now, of course, what this sets off is waves of violence across the country. You even see that President Johnson did not go to the funeral. He was afraid that it would cause disruption. He urges calm in the United States. But reality is racial riots, racial violence would break out across the United States. DC, Chicago, Baltimore, Louisville, Kansas City. In total, only 39 people die, which is small considering how widespread it was, but it would take 75,000 National Guardsmen to quell the violence. And to many, this assassination of Dr. King illustrated that racism was still a major problem. Yes, the Civil Rights Acts were monumental, but racism was still a major problem. And this only begins to harden some of those activists who had already splintered off, the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement. Now, please note, Dr. King's death is not the end of the civil rights movement, but it is irreparably fractured. Now, it had already been fracturing, but his death irreparably fractures the movement, and it begins to splinter off. Groups continue, but the strength of that early national pride, early national unity, never returned to what it once was. Instead, these smaller groups like the Black Panthers, like SNCC, they were each vying for authority within the power vacuum left behind when Dr. King was assassinated. And to make a kind of a further note here, a foreshadowing, his assassination and the racial violence is going to play an integral part of the 1968 election. Remember, 68 is also an election year. But it's not the only thing that will play a part. Yeah, the racial violence is important, and we'll talk about that. The other big issue, though, is, of course, Vietnam. Now, back in January of 1968, North Vietnam began to plan a significant attack on the U.S.-held South Vietnam. And again, this becomes a turning point of the Vietnam War for a number of reasons. So on January 31st, 1968, the Viet Cong, the Southern Communist rebels fighting in South Vietnam, along with the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese military, again, both sides are agreed communist, but the North Vietnamese are fighting from the north, whereas the Viet Cong are already in the south fighting a guerrilla-style insurgent warfare. And on January 31st, the Viet Cong, along with the Viet Minh, the Northern Vietnamese military, planned an all-out assault on U.S.-held military bases in South Vietnam. And this caught the U.S. by surprise because the 31st was a national holiday known as the holiday of Tet. It's the New Year, first day of the New Year on the lunar calendar, celebrated, one of the most important holidays celebrated by the Vietnamese. And there was supposed to be a 2-day ceasefire to celebrate the holiday. However, to catch the Americans by surprise, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong will launch a surprise attack, and they will catch the Americans off guard. And what they do is, if you can look at the map here, they don't go directly from the north into the south, but rather they rally their troops and their missiles through Laos and Cambodia and launch their attacks from there. Now, the offensive begins early in the morning on January 31st and will continue for a couple days. This becomes the largest military operation up to that point in the Vietnam War. Of course, the purpose was to strike both military and civilian command centers and basically try to force the Americans off guard, deal a decisive blow. Now, did it catch the Americans by surprise? Yes. Did it work as far as, did they hit a number of our targets? Yes. Was it really effective? No. Because the Americans actually rebounded quickly. They were able to push back the attack. And the North Vietnamese will sustain tremendous loss in the Tet offensive. And the reality is, if you look at the numbers, the U.S. actually win this battle decisively. Because think about it, this is not guerrilla warfare, this is a general warfare attack. And the U.S. is able to beat it back quickly. However, while on the ground the battle was won, this event caused America to lose the moral battle. They lost the will to fight. Because up until the Tet offensive, our government under LBJ had been promising the American public. And this was not only given by LBJ, but also being parroted by the news media, that North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, were on the ropes. They were on their heels. We were winning. It was just a matter of time until they surrendered. But the Tet Offensive revealed to the American public that the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong in the South, they were nowhere near ready to surrender. They would fight to the bitter end. And what it revealed was this quote-unquote credibility gap. We talked about the missile gap back in the early 60s. Well, by 1968, we developed a credibility gap. And the credibility gap was a credibility of truth between our government and the people of the United States. The American public had been insisting we were close to victory. The Tet Offensive signaled that we were not. And instead, the American public began to question the veracity of our U.S. government. And again, this credibility gap represents the gap between what the American public expected and what the reality was going on in Vietnam. And the Tet Offensive only exacerbated this credibility gap that had already been building, which we talked about with the war protest. And so the Tet Offensive is a turning point in the Vietnam War because it officially marks the turning point when the vast majority of Americans were now against the war in Vietnam. You see the chart here. After the Tet Offensive, there is no longer popular support for this war. Even among those die-hard Cold Warriors, the Tet Offensive shows that, yeah, there's a problem here. The war had always been unpopular, but this dissent became more widespread, not just with the young people being drafted, but by all Americans, including the media. Up to this point, the media had largely parroted and supported the U.S. government, including LBJ. But on the nightly news on CBS, Walter Cronkite, who was considered the most trusted man in America as a newscaster, he got on television and boldly proclaimed, "The president has been lying to us." He had lost faith and trust in our government, and the American people followed as well. This is how important the media is when it comes to propaganda in war. As a result, again, we won the battle, but we lost that credibility gap now. We no longer trusted our government. Up until this point, we largely trust the government had our best interest. The government would not lie to us. But now we realize they had been. And LBJ will spend the last 6 months of his presidency trying to negotiate a peace agreement. But unfortunately, he will get no credit for this because by the time peace does come, he will no longer be president. In fact, the other big legacy of the Tet Offensive is it convinced LBJ to not seek a second term. Remember, he took over for Kennedy in November of '63. He served 1 year of Kennedy's term, and then he was elected on his own accord in '64, which means he still had one more term to go if he wanted it. The Vietnam War weighed so heavily on him, especially the Tet Offensive, that he finally agrees he's not going to run for re-election. And by April of 1968, he's done. He announces the Democratic Party, he will not seek re-election. And so the 1968 election becomes another big election in our history. Again, anti-war movement blamed LBJ for our intervention in Vietnam. Now, again, to be fair though, remember, troops were already there before he took office, took power. John Kennedy started putting him there, but he did escalate. There's no doubt about that. So March 31st, 1968, he announced he will not run for president, and instead, who should the party turn to? But of course, Bobby Kennedy. He becomes the perfect replacement candidate for LBJ. He's young, he's well-liked, and of course, he has the credibility of both, especially the African-American and Latino community. He becomes the poster child. He's the easy pick to replace LBJ on the ticket. Now, there were two other people as well. So the youth support Bobby Kennedy. Hubert Humphrey, he is a staunch defender of the war. Now, he was also LBJ's vice president in '64, and so he's supported by the older Democratic Party elites. He defends the war in Vietnam because, again, he was VP as it's going on. The other candidate is Eugene McCarthy. He's also supported by the youth, and he's known as an anti-war candidate. So in this election, we mainly have these three candidates vying for the Democratic nomination. And we'll get to the Republican side in a minute. But for now, though, we need to talk about the Democratic side. Now, Bobby Kennedy wasn't quite the media darling that JFK had been. But he had that considerable voting bloc. He had the religious vote. He had the African-American vote. He had the Mexican-American vote. He had the liberal Democratic vote. He had the youth vote. He had the anti-war vote. Unfortunately, as he begins ramping up his candidacy to be the Democrat nominee, on June 5th, 1968, he gives a speech after winning the California primary. As he's exiting the hotel through the kitchen, he's assassinated by a Palestinian by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. He had been angry that Bobby Kennedy supported Israel in the Six-Day War, and Sirhan Sirhan will shoot him 3 times in the chest, thus assassinating Bobby Kennedy, her second major assassination this year. Now, we could spend a long time talking about the implication of Bobby Kennedy, but we're going to move on quickly through this. Instead, there are now 2 candidates left now. We have Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey, both who are seeking the nomination. Now, right now, currently in the United States, we're in the Democrat primary season, which is being disrupted, of course, by the coronavirus. But the process is largely held in almost every state in our country. But back in 1968, only 14 states held a primary. And instead, in all the other states, only the party elites would actually vote for the party nominee. Add to that Hubert Humphrey, he had not competed in any of those other 14 primary elections. In other words, not a single average Democratic voter had actually cast a vote that would support Hubert Humphrey to be the Democratic nominee. But now that Bobby Kennedy's been assassinated, his only competition is the young Eugene McCarthy. And so really the 1968 Democratic nomination process came down to old school Cold War liberalism, represented by Humphrey, and a rising anti-war sentiment within the Democratic Party, who was sick of the Cold War and what it called the U.S. imperialism, led by Eugene McCarthy. What it also signals, though, that the liberal consensus that was pioneered by FDR, that had existed for 50 years, was now in disarray. And that Cold War consensus we've been talking about, that consensus that we all agree the Cold War is bad, we have to win it, that's also beginning to unravel here. And as a result, when these 2 men gather at the Democratic nomination, Democratic National Convention held in Chicago that year, young protesters gather outside the convention center. Now, this is a very strange image. This is a hill here, is why they don't look like they're on top of each other. But they gather outside the convention center, and again, nearly all of these youth are supporting Eugene McCarthy. Remember, none of them in any state had actually voted for Hubert Humphrey. Now, what you don't see in this picture is the convention center. You also don't see 24,000 Chicago police and National Guardsmen who are surrounding these protesters. The Chicago Mayor, Richard Daley, had said that he will not tolerate any violence, any protesting or rioting. Young protesters, again, mainly from that new left we talked about last time, they vehemently opposed Humphrey because of his stance on Vietnam, that he supported the war in Vietnam. They opposed that Cold War consensus liberal tradition that he stood for, and they were lining up for Eugene McCarthy. And of course, when the old guard Democratic Party nominated Hubert Humphrey, they broke out into a riot. And outside the convention center, these young people, the new left, began rioting and protesting, so much so the police began to use tear gas and billy clubs to brutalize the protesters. The interesting part was that all of this happened on live television, signifying to America the Democratic Party was a mess. They were torn apart by the Vietnam War. They were torn apart by generational conflict between this new left and the old guard Democratic Party. The other interesting idea or thing here was that, many people took, polls after the event and asked Americans what they thought of this riot. And the majority of Americans actually voted in favor of the police action against the protesters. In other words, they thought that these young people got what they had coming to them. Of course, all of this gives heart to the Republican Party, who decided to meet in Miami that year for their national convention. And they will rally behind their nominee, Richard Nixon. Yes, Tricky Dick is back. The same Nixon who had unsuccessfully run against Kennedy back in 1960. He's back. And he played this election very smart on two levels. One is he became much more conservative here. He began America's turn to conservatism that we'll explain in a couple lectures from now. The other thing is he capitalizes on something. He capitalizes on the frustration of U.S. citizens of all the violence of the 1960s, of all the urban unrest in 1960, all the racial outbreaks, all the racial riots that took place in 1960, all the assassinations of the 1960s, all this upheaval and turmoil. He promised stability and order that appealed to so many Americans. Americans that Richard Nixon called the quote-unquote silent majority. Now, according to Nixon, this silent majority of Americans, who were white, middle-class Americans, who were just fed up with everything going on in America in the 1960s. They were fed up with protesters. They were fed up with riots. They were fed up with all the racism and race riots. They were fed up with the Vietnam War. They were fed up with the rebellious youth and their permissiveness, drug use, sex. They were fed up with civil rights. They were fed up with welfare benefiting only those who supposedly did not work. They were fed up with higher taxes that were being used to, in their minds, redistribute the wealth of the rich to the poor who were on welfare, who again supposedly were not working. It was not true, but that's what they believed. In other words, he got the vote of that quiet, silent majority whose only goal in life was to get up, go to work, make enough money to feed their family, come home and spend time in their suburban middle-class home in the white flight suburbs in middle America. And he tapped into that nerve, into that vein of Americana. And to the silent majority, Richard Nixon promised stability. He promised what he called law and order politics, an end to the chaos, a return to the peace and prosperity of the 1950s, to borrow a current term, to make America great again. Turn back the clock to the 1950s when things were, of course, perfect in the minds of the silent majority who lived in these lily white, middle class, upper middle class suburbs. As a result, remember, Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president of the 1950s when things seemed better. Remember, we talked about this before with the 1950s lecture. People looked at the 1950s with rosy colored glasses. Now, was it perfect? Of course not. But that's how people remembered it. Those are the good old days before all the racial violence and the outbreaks of the 1960s. And he became a symbol of the 1950s when there was peace and suburban prosperity. Now, to be fair though, not only was he promised to restore order, he was running as a very social conservative. But he still remains a staunch anti-communist when it comes to foreign policy. Interesting to note, there was actually a third-party candidate this year, and that was our old friend, George Wallace. Yes, the same George Wallace from Alabama who stood in front of the University of Alabama, the same one who, on his inauguration, said, segregation tomorrow, segregation today, segregation forever. Wallace ran as his own presidential candidate for the American Independent Party. a states' rights party that was based largely on racial segregation. So he wants to turn back the clock as well, back to Jim Crow laws, segregation. And of course, he does appeal to those white working class communities, both inside and outside the South. People who resented the Great Society of liberalism, people who resented expanding welfare programs, and most importantly, people who resented the expansion of civil rights. So in the 1968 election, what it really comes down to, though, is a referendum on the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, probably rightfully so, was seen as LBJ's war. Nixon, meanwhile, was seen in nostalgic terms, a symbol of the peaceful 1950s. Nixon promised he had a plan to win Vietnam. He called it a secret plan. He promised it would be, quote, peace with honor. And sure enough, Nixon easily wins the 1968 election with 301 electoral votes. Conservatism was on the rise. Now, we're not quite there yet. The turning point, of course, is 1980. But it's on the rise, fueled by a decline and disarray of liberalism on the left. Nixon wins by a pretty narrow popular majority. He won 43.6%, whereas Humphrey had 42.9%. It was very close. And just to make note, George Wallace, Mr. Segregationist, he wins 13.5% of the vote. Nonetheless, what 1968 represents in all those things is the rifts of the Democratic Party illustrated a growing distaste for U.S. liberalism, for that liberal consensus. Where in 1964, liberalism was at an all-time high. 1968, in large part thanks to the Vietnam War and the racial riots across our country, liberalism became unraveled. Southerners had already leaned more conservative, but Republicans began to excise liberals from their party. Americans wanted change, and Nixon's law and order was the idea of blaming liberalism for all the racial violence. What he argued with law and order politics was that liberalism with the Democratic Party enabled racial violence, enabled youth rebellion, youth violence, and youth protest. And so it marks a decisive decline for modern liberalism. As we'll soon see, conservatism begins to become the way of the future. It's not there yet, but it's getting close. Now, I want to leave off with one good thing with 1968, because 1968 was a year of turmoil. Now, as the year came to a close, a couple good things happened. Now, for me, since I'm from Michigan, 1968, the Detroit Tigers won the World Series over the St. Louis Cardinals. For the rest of the country, however, the one redeeming quality was Apollo 8 was the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon. Now, we'll wait till 1969 to actually land on the moon. But what was interesting was, as Apollo 8 emerged from the dark side of the moon, a relieved Jim Lovell announced to the world when he finally got communication back with Houston, said, quote, Houston, please be informed, there is a Santa Claus. And of course, this took place in December of 1968. It was a humorous moment to a tumultuous year. And a telegram that came back to the astronauts after they got back to Earth said, you saved 1968. In other words, they were the bright spot in a very dark year. Racial violence, assassinations, and the unraveling of American liberalism. Now, when we come back next time, we will talk about Nixon's presidency, we will talk about the end of the Vietnam War, and jump into the 1970s, which, quite honestly, is a quite depressing decade. But until next time, have a great day. We'll see you then. Until then,